I'd like to, Andreas, please come on up. Introduce Andreas Lattmann. And Andreas is the CTO and the head of planning and projects at TPC. And he's come to share with us his insights on the work he's doing on planning the 2110-based facility.
So just lost my micro, sorry for that. I'll be right there. Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to present our strategy. First of all, I'm from Switzerland, not from Sweden. It's not the same country. In Switzerland, there are 4 different languages spoken. I am from the German part, so I live in Zurich, which is not the capital, from Switzerland, which is not Sweden. This is basically what...
This is a long shade for Sweden.
It is, but a lot of Americans always mismatch these 2 countries. So that's basically our network. So we have a total of 7 TV channels, some 16 radio channels, and of course a lot of OTT products. Unfortunately, we are under construction of a new building. So why unfortunately? It's because it will be on air in September 2019, and it's called Technology Building. So what it will be on the basement, there will be a big data center, so some 300 racks around. Then in the ground floor, there will be a huge studio landscape. First floor is the technology floor, master switching room, playout ingest. And the 3 stories above are basically editorial rooms, but of course including post-production, including radio, including areas where we are able to present. Also, the idea is to make TV shows or online products just by the journalist itself, so without any technicians in parallel. So what do I have to decide as a CTO of TPC to go in technology when it has to be on air in 2 years' time? It's too late for 3 gig SDI. It's too early for all the other IP stuff. But I decided to go to ST2110, UHD ready, so 4K HDR. Fortunately, we are also building a new OB van in advanced. It's a quite big van compared to American sizes. It's still small, but it's a 24 cameras UHD HDR truck, and it will be on air in around Q1 next year. Steve is still shaking his head a bit, but we will see. So that will be also based on ST2110, 24 cameras, as I already mentioned, and of course, because it's a long-term strategy, I want to be completely standards-based and AIMS compliant. Main products in there, interfaces, SDN, and multi-viewers from Imagine, Sony Vision mixers, so MVS 8000 and 6000, then Arista as a network, Stage Deck for audio, Lavo for the broadcast control system, so the VSM, EVS for slows and replays, and Sono VTS is the constructor of the building based in Munich. That's basically how it will look like. So in the heart there is a redundant Arista 7504 network, and whatever capable to be connected directly in ST2110 will be connected directly. So for example, the complete Epic multi-viewer from Imagine will be IP-based, IP connected. But unfortunately, we also need some 44 interfaces from Imagine. Each of the interfaces has 4 channels. So unfortunately, this is the way we have to go, because a lot of products will come, but not a lot of products are available at the actual moment. As I mentioned before, we will go to UHD. So it's also a bit a problem with the vision mixer, because the big vision mixers, they usually have some 160, 190 ins, but if you calculate them in UHD, they are divided by 4. So you have in the end some 40, 50 sources that are really available in parallel. So we decided to make kind of a pre-switching, not a pre-routing, pre-switching That means that the vision mixer will talk via the VSM to the SDN layer, to the broadcast controller, and then pre-select some sources between the IP network and the vision mixer. We've also decided to go redundant. This is not the graphics from me, it's from John Mailhot, but it's good. For the OB WAN, we have this kind of redundancy based on ST2022.7. So we should be able to handle switch fails, optical fails, cable fails. For the building, of course, it will be a much different size, but also there we are on the AIMS roadmap, and there it's a spine leaf network, also fully redundant, but not non-blocking, while in the OB WAN it's non-blocking. So what are the biggest challenges we have? This is how it looked up to now. So we have a very, very basic workflow. It's in, it's production, it's channel aggregation, it's out, and all these different building blocks that were grown in the past. But now we need one common transport layer throughout the complete production chain. So we do not separate input, production, and channel aggregation anymore. There is just one building block. Why is it called building block 0? Because it's called like this in our project. So it's, I think, personally the most important building block in this new facility. Another building block is acquisition. It's ingest and it's master control room. But of course, it's not just live streams, baseband, however you call. It's also file-based. So my vision is to have one common input block where whatever comes from wherever can be handled. So transcoding, audio routing, ingest, playout, whatever is needed from the destination afterwards. Then we have, of course, the post-production, news and sports post-production, basically in this new building. Studio production, also quite straightforward. What is a bit different is that we will have different sizes of galleries. We are much more automated than you are here in the States because our stuff is unfortunately very expensive. So we reduced, for example, our news production last year to go from 13 to 5 people per show from the technical side. And then we will also have the aggregation layout, so we will not separate 24/7 broadcast channels with some event channels, with some VOD. So that's all in this building block number 4. So this was the decision we had to make. On the left-hand side, you see full IP. On the right-hand side, you see SDI. Sorry for the German words in there. Why not SDI? Because I think, and also my team thinks, it's not future-proof. Why not hybrid? We just saw an example of hybrid infrastructures. We think it's not a clear architecture, and it has a very, very high complexity. Because we have a greenfield approach in this new building, we decided not to go that way. We decided to be UHD ready. So highly flexible and future-proof, and risks getting smaller because it's not hybrid, not because it's IP. But we then can scale very, very easy to UHD whenever needed. Or, depending on our negotiations, possibly already from the beginning. Depends a bit on the budget. But we think that this is the right approach to go in this greenfield area. So we need an orchestrator. We already heard timing is essential. We have to think about security. We have to find our devices, of course, and we have to handle a wide range of IP addresses. For example, in the truck, because we do AES 67 and we do ST2110-24 video, we have around 35,000 multicast IP addresses. So think about the amount of addresses in the new building. It will be in the millions. It's not really fun to do this in Excel. So we decided to do a technology certification system. That means we invited vendors to us. It's not just a showcase, it's not just a plug fest. We invited them really to show their actual stage of their products, plugging together different equipment and figuring out how it works in reality. So we set up 2 systems. In the end, there were 6 independent network islands, 4 times with Cisco, 2 times with Arista. So same setting, spine leaf architecture, quite straightforward. And then we had tests during 3 or 4 weeks this summer when we invited these vendors. I don't read through all these points. I just want to show you what we were focusing on. So it was standards oriented, it was architecture oriented, stability, security issues, bandwidth management, orchestration, and roadmap. This is one of the results, and it's quite typical because you see, of course, I will not tell you which vendor it was, but roadmap is usually not the problem. But in this example, you see standards is not really good. Architecture is not what we expected. Stability and security is not really on a level that we want. Then some yellow points like bandwidth management, orchestration, and already mentioned roadmap is very green. Just compare, that's another vendor which is much better, I think. So also there you see some yellow points. Bandwidth management is still an issue. Standards fulfillment is still an issue. And bandwidth management, in my perspective, is really a challenge because we cannot afford to have non-blocking networks in such a huge infrastructure that we build. Orchestration, as already mentioned before, personally I think that's the big challenge. We don't want just to copy-paste SDI workflows into an IP world. I think there is much more to come. As already heard before, when we went from tape-based production to file-based production, it was not just copying workflows. It was really a mind change, and that's what I expect as well. I don't really know what will change, but I'm sure there will be a lot of changes. Second point we figured out, PTP, timing, a big issue. Of course there are standards, but we are the first in the industry that use these standards in reality. So it's still a crucial point to really get networks in PTP timing. So some impressions, what we are looking forward to. I hope it will look like this, especially with all the nice pictures. That's the studio landscape that we expect. So different areas, a lot of glass, which is another subject, quite challenging as well, some audio issues and so. But that's basically what I plan to do, and hopefully I will give you an update in the next couple of months how we progress in this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. We'll have Andreas come up for some discussion in a little bit. But first, I'd like to introduce my friend John Meidt. Where's John? Come on up, John. John is going to cover some advice from AIMS in terms of system architecture guidelines and what's the manufacturer perspective on building systems. Sure, John.
Where's the clicker? All right. And I'll say right away that which almost never the case for me, these are not my slides. So if I trip over them, well, that's okay. They're made by a combination of people. One of the beautiful things about AIMS, as Mr. Kronk mentioned earlier, AIMS is a collaboration among a very large set of vendors and some customers as well, which is great. We need that customer perspective. Really to set a common roadmap and a common way of going about things. So at first we dealt with very broad topics, what standards are we going to use, which was important, and we got through that. Now we're into this sort of next phase about how are we going to use those standards? Because within each of the standards in SMPTE and AMWA and so forth, there's a pretty wide range of what you could do. And as you start moving into IP technology with all these things, there's a million ways to hook up the switches. There's a million ways to organize the equipment. And if you'd like the vendor community to test things thoroughly, ideally we could constrain the problem a little bit or have some kind of typical approaches. I don't really want to say standard approaches, but at least typical approaches, that way we can work through things at great length. So as Mike mentioned, the AIMS is about promoting the standards that people will use to move from there to where we're going without killing our budgets. So within AIMS, there's a technical working group, there's an architecture subgroup, and it's the usual suspects. I see I see Chuck Meyer in the room, I see Suba in the room, there's a few other people also involved. I think Thomas might be, I don't know. There's this number of people. We got together over time to create reference system designs that really were just like saying, here's a typical way to do this. And of course, we very quickly realized that what's typical for a modest-sized system is not necessarily typical for a very large system. And so there's probably different branches of the reference architecture. And likewise, something self-contained like a truck is a very different undertaking than a production campus or a interworking of facilities or trucks to facilities and so forth. So, at the risk of saying typical, there have to be some variations of typical. But that said, we persisted. Now, obviously, you could look at saying, well, we're just going to do everything the traditional way, but using new infrastructure. And while we all know that eventually we will do things in new ways with new infrastructure, as we look at things like the transition from tape to disk, if anyone's old enough to remember that, the first 7, 8, 10 years of that, we used servers exactly as if they were tape decks, all the way down to the editor protocols, right? Mounting a file. Why would you mount a file? Like, you mounted a tape, right? Because so we used all the same lingo. So at least in these early typical use cases, we actually did say, let's model the way the workflow works today, more or less, rather than saying, well, let's invent a new workflow to go with the new technology. Because often, as I said in some one of these panels years ago, the people are actually the slowest evolving part of these technology infrastructures. So we have to always respect that. So that said, we came up with some architectural templates. Now the first one is the simple small system. And your definition of small might actually be pretty large. The truck Mr. Lattmann just talked about, for example, is effectively this architecture. Dual switches, because the switch could fail. Doesn't happen often. They've got redundant power, they've got redundant controllers, this, that, but things can fail, right? The optics can fail. People talked about the optics fail with alarming regularity, particularly when they're bouncing down the road and getting heated up and cooled off every other day. The ISO 4 registration, so you can find all the parts, very handy standard. That's a recommendation, whatever the right word is. We've used a lot of words for that. But it exists, it's published, it's out there on GitHub, and you can read it for free, unlike SMPTE standards. Just a little dig there. Now, as a base layer, you can use IGMP between devices and switches, and if you're interested in the performance aspects of that, come to the SMPTE technical conference next week, and there'll be a couple papers about that. But of course, that works great. You can have you want to have all these things in a single PTP domain. The right number of PTP domains in a facility like this is 1, not 0, not several, but 1 PTP domain. And the control system can leverage the ISO 4 as well as the ISO 5 to do connection management. So ISO 4 is how you find things. ISO 5 is how you tell that multi-viewer PIP to take that signal. These systems are stood up in a number of customers. This basically works. And this is the base case of how you use 2110 to make television. Now, as systems scale to be much, much larger, you get to the point where the spines are large enough to do the job, but often these interfaces from the devices are kind of underutilized, let's say. So you have maybe an SFP that does one signal or two signals, or you have a device like a camera that generates, a signal, and maybe it has a prompter return, some other things, but it doesn't really fill the output interface. So in order to get the right level of utilization, you want to have the spine ports be fairly well utilized, which means you have leafs doing aggregation in order to keep the economics of the system in check and keep the economics reasonable. Now, still you can have the full redundancy model with the A and B sides, or primary and protect, or I think every customer has a different nomenclature for what they call those two sides. When you start doing the IP networking this way, you get into using IGMP and PIM together, which is a perfectly viable solution when you have enough bandwidth, when you've designed it in a non-blocking way. If you need to go into a blocking model because you have more stuff going in the leafs that can fit to the spines, for example, or you have some other combination of things that might be blocking, then you move into this network controller work going on in the AMWA, where the network controller really does the bandwidth management and says, even though you're allowed to connect this device to that device, I'm still going to say no because you can't actually do it right now. And this is very much akin to in systems today where you have a lot of tie lines, and if you go to take that n+1th take, the system says, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I can't let you do that. Okay, some people are old enough to have seen that. That's good. And the control system obviously leverages the ISO 4 and the ISO 5 to do its work. So this is kind of the template B for larger systems. Now, contribution within the AIMS members, we talked about this a fair bit. We said, is 2110 a contribution format? And the answer is, well, you could use 2110 to contribute signals, but generally when you pencil out the economics of actually reaching the venue, there's not that many venues where the local telco wants to jump up and sell you 10, 20, 50, 100 gigabits to the venue. I mean, they'd love to sell it to you, but the price might be prohibitive. So our view as we evolved it was that contribution likely will continue to be J2K, H.264, the technologies we use today for contribution. They work, they meet the economic model, and nothing about changing the studio to be a 2110 environment changes the economics of the contribution. That economics is dictated by equipment costs and leases of fibers and all the things that it's dictated by today. So, continue to think about J2K, especially the VSF TR01 standard, great standard that one, and H.264 ultra low latency and other typical contribution techniques. That's really still kind of the best way to do contribution, unless you have a special relationship about the bandwidth, and then you can obviously go to the uncompressed situations. And then again, within the facility, the ISO 4 all works fine, but the outside plant, really this is a signal that's managed probably roughly the way you do it today. Now, in the case of a large campus environment, you can start to stretch the bounds of where PTP makes sense to have one PTP domain. There's some number of cable feet or cable miles or cable kilometers that you start to have some issues of trying to stretch one PTP domain to cross an extraordinarily large facility. So it's okay to think about 2110 as a remotable system, but you have to recognize the fact that if you have enough milliseconds worth of cable or microseconds worth of network transit delay between the remote and the studio, you wind up needing a synchronizer. There's no magic, it's physics. You just, synchronization is still an issue. 2110 has a pretty narrow window of how tightly the signals are supposed to be lined up to each other and to the PTP. And so if you have signals coming from someplace remote enough, you're going to need to at least rephase them. Even if the frequency's right, you'll have to put the phasing back to be correct when it gets to the studio. Again, nothing new under the sun in that regard. That's just how many kilometers of cable and how many, how long it takes the light to go down the fiber. But that said, sometimes, depending on, maybe this remote facility isn't even really on the same frequency base as you. Maybe your plant is tied to PTP really nicely. Maybe the truck is parked in a shadow where it can't get can't get GPS, and so it's running on a local oscillator and it's drifting just a little. Even if it's not, you sort of have to prepare that it could have been, because maybe it will be at the next game. It's always a worry that the other end might not be actually locked to GPS the way you wished. It could happen. So again, you still have to keep track of the inside and the outside and what's in my time domain, what's in the foreign time domain, and be prepared to synchronize. Now, the other thing that we were getting to in this template was really talking about the integration of routing systems, that you might have a whole nother routing domain over here, you have a routing domain over here. You can put together some kind of gateway. What's probably not really the best way to think about it, some people think about, oh, well, just have ISO4 go discover every device in the entire universe. And it could, but likely you want to mitigate the complexity of your system a little bit and think, no, let's think about this as a system, let's think about that as a system, and have some higher level, organization of how they interact. Let's see, and that really was our thought in the last one, is even if systems are actually close enough together that the PTP could work and they're all in the same timing domain and everything else, maybe it's buildings, it's like 30 Rock and Englewood or whatever, that kind of distance. You could stretch a PTP domain that far. You could lock it all up, everything else. Often in large organizations, there's still, I'll call them administrative zones. I think in the IP switching world, they call them administrative systems, ASs or ISs. So sometimes, even though these things could be one giant system for management purposes, organizational boundaries, maybe it's news and sports or whatever, there's a, my system and your system are separately organized and they're separately managed, and my names are my names and your names are your names. And this is not a technical problem. This is more of an administrative issue within large enterprises, right? But you may still want to think about keeping the routing zones separate just for management purposes, irrespective of technology purposes. Now, legacy devices are with us. This is the reality of the situation. I've never met a broadcaster who would throw away a piece of equipment that had any sign of life left in it. And if it has even the slightest sign of life, we send it off to Mr. Turner, and he's got a truckload of them out there. So, in case anyone needs a quad deck. So you really have to look at what are you trying to do. In the words of our friend Peter Dare, who's not here to respond, when you're building a new facility, you have to look at what problem am I trying to solve. Am I producing content? Am I a playout center? Am I an island? Or am I, and to really think through how the facility needs to work. IP gives you a whole suite of tools. The tools are more flexible, but ultimately you have to focus on the people workflow. What are the job descriptions? What does it mean to be an editor in 2020? What does it mean to be a graphics producer in 2019? All these jobs are changing just slightly as the technology itself collapses together. So, it's a little different world. Now, audio is a big deal, right? Audio is the problem. Audio is the hardest part of television. Does anyone disagree that audio is the hardest part of television? Because, picture's up, we're done. Oh wait, we got to set up audio. That's the rest of the day. So again, as you look at these systems, 2110 is very much driven by the need to do audio breakaway, or the desirability to be able to break away any signal, any place. But then again, you also get to choose how you bundle the audio. Do you route it as monos? Do you route it as stereos? Do you route it as 4s, 8s? And this is not something the audio world itself has actually settled on. If you talk to different people who've implemented AES 67 in the pure audio world, there's no clear consensus in the audio world. The people who do live sound and do orchestra productions, they like big fat stems with lots and lots of channels. People who do news, they like mono. And then there's every opinion in between those two, right? So that's in the build out of these systems, again, all things are possible, but over time, as an industry, we're going to wind up with some consensuses of, stereo is a nice trade-off between almost mono, but not quite, cuts the number of multicast groups in half. I think 35,000 was assuming maybe it was mono. I don't remember. I think we're doing stereo, so it's a lot of groups, and that last factor of 2 is quite an explosion, or not. Compressed audio, Dolby E and the 47 other things that are defined in SMPTE 337. Again, 2110 supports them. And then there's the matter of Dante and Ravenna, which is sort of the elephant in the room, because Dante is pretty widely deployed. There is an AES 67 compatibility mode, but it's, we're realizing, we're getting there as an industry. So what are these AMWA things? Brad talked about them, but really they solve 2 problems that matter. There's the finding all the parts, which ISO 4 does, and then there's how do I tell a receiver what stream to join? It's very simple systems, and both of these are now published real documents that are available. I think the ISO 5 is published in the last few weeks, but it's there, and I'd say every vendor who cares to be a part of the industry going forward is somehow involved in these already. So it's been quite a collaborative development of both these standards. And they're built using normal stuff. These are not some wacky thing. They're built using RESTful APIs and DNS and all the stuff that the same supports the scale of the internet. So how does a live production work? Kind of like you'd hope. The remote things get gatewayed in. Local devices increasingly have IP interfaces directly, and they tie into an IP network. Now, what happens, we've talked about all this stuff, I think, in the last 4 talks, so I won't dwell on it again. But in the AIMS standpoint, remember, one of AIMS's charters is about education and about really getting the word out that there's one consistent roadmap. So ideas of how we can do that better are always welcome. And that said, we're kind of at the end of that rope.
So there was actually the plan to have lunch at 12:15. I think we are probably interested to have a Q&A session with Glenn. So I think if everybody's okay with that, we just push out lunch 10 minutes and have a Q&A.
Starvation.
Yep. Okay.
Glenn,
go ahead.
All right, thanks, Thomas. Andreas, come on up, and Tim and Thomas, please come on back up. Let me start with a quick question for John. John, what's the plan to continue to revise and update the AIMS architecture document, based on deployment experiences like we've heard from our panelists today? What's to go forward?
I'd say everyone involved agrees that that's a really good idea. But it's like any organization, it's subject to the people's time and effort and so forth. So it certainly is a need to provide some guidance to the industry, some evolving what are basically best practices. If you think about an SDI facility today, simple things like the video comes out the top of the patch and it goes in the bottom. You don't have to explain that to people in your plant; they know. But in IP, every simple thing like that, how do you label the cables? Like, there's not we don't have yet as an industry a best practice for any aspect of this stuff, but we will within the next couple of years, and those will get developed and written down by us, by all of us here in this room and our colleagues elsewhere.
We might be able to take some of the best practices of data center, the architecture, and be able to move those, because they figured out in data centers how to label the cables and things like that. But we'll have to figure out how to take that and apply it to the broadcast world.
Yeah, but it is a challenge, because in SDI the cable says camera 1. Couldn't be more clear. I don't know what to write on the cable just now.
That's true. Andreas, let me question based on your presentation. You talked about having a facility that is Ultra HD ready. and you showed us some very interesting, evaluations of equipment that you've been doing. What's your experience with finding equipment that is multi-format, that might handle a UHD signal, but also a traditional HD signal? With an IP backbone, the backbone doesn't care, but the equipment still does. What are your thoughts?
So, for example, in the truck, we do 12 gig, and we do in parallel a proxy in 3 gig, so 1080p. And for example, that works quite well. So to have two formats in parallel, of course, both 50 hertz in Europe, but also switching the truck, for example, to 60 hertz shouldn't be an issue. But we do not expect to distribute something else than 1080i SDR or 4K HDR. So a direct step from one technology to another one.
Good, thank you for that perspective. Other thoughts about that question, about the availability of multi-format equipment and how we're going to deal with that complexity in addition to some of the other things?
I think it's just making your system as flexible as it can be. We haven't tackled that point yet for us, but certainly we're seeing that now where we're going from 1.5 to 3 gig and doubling the bandwidth. Had we thought about that up front, there's a cost for that, for more ports, and we always have to weigh that cost benefit as we look towards the future.
Yeah, there is at least one 4K truck in Europe that's using compressed methodologies, using TICO, rather than trying to use uncompressed 4K. And obviously that's an easy stepping stone, but then you have to work in the costs of the encoders and decoders on that. But if you're in a situation where you just have encapsulators and de-encapsulators from SDI, instead of having that FPGA, having a TICO FPGA probably isn't that much of a cost change.
Okay, we talked a lot about large-scale facilities, and as you think about those, it seems to me we don't always get to manage all of our address space. I mean, we do when we control an ingest or a translator. But how do you think about IP address space, NAT, network address translation, in a very distributed world? Thoughts about how that's going to impact systems? All right, John, I'll start with you.
It's much like the concept we talked about there of sort of administrative boundaries, right? And that's very much in the IP routing world. That's what they talk about is administrative boundaries of the address space that we administrate, and then there's NAT for the rest of the universe. So inside our enterprise, there's a 10 dot something that's all our PCs. Those aren't real addresses; those are administratively internal addresses. I think the same methodology will happen for a long time. That the administrative boundary of the facility is sort of where the scope of the multicast groups takes hold, and then you have you can certainly do multicast to multicast NAT on the way in or on the way out. And sometimes you need to. In fact, usually the long haul doesn't even support multicast. You wind up doing unicast on the long haul, multicast in the administrative zone, and then having unicast delivery again at the output side. But that's just like it's a lot like the host address space, that you will have sort of zones of administrative control, and you have to keep your multicast addresses straight within there. The good news is there's 2 to the 24th multicast groups. The bad news is they go quicker than you think.
Well, that's only
Other thoughts, and that brings me to the next question.
That's only IPv4, right?
Yeah.
So
IPv6 will fix all these things.
That was exactly my next question. What do you all think about IPv6?
Well, I'd like to address the address translation piece.
Yeah, please.
So we talk about that a lot because where we go to host broadcasted events, Olympics, many of these different world championship skiing, that address translation will be in our future probably sooner than we think. I don't think we're going to see it in the 2018 games, but I think in 2020, as host broadcasters and others move to IP routing, we're going to have a host of, well, pardon the pun, IP translation devices, NAT translation to go between us. It's just inevitable.
Yeah, and we're dealing with this in our private line networks right now, obviously at lower data rates than what we do with uncompressed. But multicast network address translation is a bit of an unusual thing. network address translation, restamping a single destination IP address for unicast, that's pretty easy. You can do that in merchant silicon pretty simply. But doing it, if you had to take one input and have it come out of a bunch of different ports with different destination IP addresses, that is something that's a little unusual. So we actually do it now by having some recurrent Ethernet cables that could go out of the switch, they come back into the switch, and that's how we're able to accomplish that right now. Now, with some of these more flexible switching silicon solutions, like some of the programmable data planes from Cavium or from Barefoot, you can make them do whatever you want. So we think that there'll be some great flexibility from these programmable data plane silicons.
It's the same for us. So, for example, at the backplane of the OB WAN, of course, we have a lot of different options to connect us. And if you want to connect via IP, of course, it needs NAT, because otherwise it's too dangerous for us also that another broadcaster crashes our system. So as you had up to now just the distribution amplifier and then the BNC connector, of course, you need something in IP as well. So that's what we do there.
Let me ask, there's a logical follow-on question, then I'll open it up to the attendees. When we talk about address translation and importing addresses, does that create a new kind of cybersecurity risk?
Sure, yeah. Sure. I mean, I think ultimately anytime where you connect different systems via IP, that risk is going to exist. I can't define it right now, but that risk is definitely going to be there.
Well, we're making our systems more flexible and agile, and they'll also be more flexible and agile to attack, which is so your cybersecurity will have to become more flexible and agile to deal with those flexible and agile attacks.
But this is also where this notion of administrative boundaries really takes hold. Even if you trust the multicast address allocation on the other side of that administrative boundary, you may want to have the sort of the moral equivalent of a firewall there anyway, that at least only the groups you're expecting are coming in.
Probably a good new chapter for AIMS guidelines version 2.
Well, something, when I think about AMWA ISO 6, the network control API, I like to sell it in terms of no packet moves on the network without prior authorization. And I think that's the kind of situation we've got to be in order to make sure that we're not going to have any problems.
Great, thank you all. Let me open it to the audience for questions. Howard.
So what about comm systems? Nobody's been talking about that. How does that integrate in with your facilities, and does it get in the IP world? Is it not going to touch this? It's going to be separate?
We're separate right now. I think ultimately it's going to have some tie-in, but it won't be going through our IP video router anytime soon. It might go down the same transport from facility to facility. But we don't have plans to commingle with the IP, let's call it the media over IP routing at this point.
Yeah, there certainly are lots of IP comm systems available now. I think 3 or 4. I have to admit, inside our network center, we've thought about, should we jump on IP comms? And we're like, what, if it's not broke, we don't need to fix it quite yet. But in the greenfield build, I think that would be a no-brainer to have IP-based comms. Probably not mixed on your video media network at this time.
Sure. Other questions?
A question about bank. And do you see in your new builds any limitation in using a bank construct in IP? Thomas, you have this RFC coming about bank over RTP. Maybe not so much for the SD2022 builds, but for the SD2110. Is there any limitations you have in regards to banking? There's a follow-up question in terms of audio. With the more advanced next generation audio formats coming, and more need for elaborate metadata. Is there any limitations you see in your system?
Up to now, we could not see any limitations, which doesn't mean that there are no, but up to now, it's not a subject for us.
Yeah, I mean, if you can carry it in SMPTE 291-1 ancillary data, it's mappable with SMPTE 2110-40, which will be based on the Ethernet RFC. it's fairly flexible. I don't see any problems with it. We certainly have a lot of thorough people from SMPTE who've looked over the document. I think we've handled every potential corner case. There are some non-SMPTE 291-1 vertical blanking interval datas out there. And I can't speak for those. I think those are dying out fairly quickly.
That brings up a related topic. What about HDR? And as we plan for HDR systems, we're liable to see a lot of new dynamic metadata have to be associated with SM streams. What about provision for that? Does that scare you? How do you feel about it?
So for us, we decided to do HDR, but we start with SLOC3, so which is quite static. But based on our experience, we will improve that to wherever it brings us. So it's not really clear at the moment. So we start at one specific point and then we'll see.
Similar, we'll be doing 4K HDR for the 2018 games, all HLG. So we haven't thought beyond that in terms of the metadata transporting around in a more dynamic way.
I think a lot of the dynamic metadata of HDR is going to be post-encoder. In other words, I don't think it's going to happen on the production side. Now, there may be generators of that metadata that want to use SMPTE 291-1 ancillary data to transport, in which case we'll put it in IP. But I think most of that is going to be between the distribution encoder and the end user.
But also there, I think it's difficult to separate, or you have to separate live production and post-production, because I think personally, if you have too many dynamic metadata to be handled in live production, it becomes quite difficult in reality. So I think that's an issue. And in post-production, you still have more time and you can do more advanced things.
Yeah, it's got to be automatic, right? It can't be someone there dialing in the ramp of the conversion curves and things, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you have a playlist and a playout center and you're harmonizing, the show segments with dynamic metadata, and then you've got interstitials that are just upconverts and things, it all gets kind of interesting there at the end.
You're not talking about subtitles.
It gets real interesting. And yeah, I had this dynamic metadata that I made for a picture, but now I put a graphic on it. Ow. We hope not. It leads me to one last question. As we talk about sort of the shift in what media consumption means to consumers, we look at more and more app-based, viewing environments, and in those environments, we're liable to deal with more, ancillary video streams as a cockpit cam or an alternate camera view, things like that. How does that affect the way that you think about orchestration and the flow of more than one media type to constitute, a single viewing experience? It's not just one video anymore. How do you think about that?
You could look at it as a level within the routing system. For us, many of those other alternate formats are created downstream. So we're not creating them in parallel. They get created from the final product output, if that answers your question. So we don't have to consider it at this point, but I think down the road that could change over time.
I think it also speaks to the continuous increase in capacity requirements in OB trucks especially. That these are going to be more video sources that we're going to need to route around the truck.
Okay, back to the audience. Any other questions for our panel? I think you're all hungry. Well, please join me in thanking our panel.